Hello, everyone. You're welcome at our very exciting event, the first meeting of our three-part series of talks, Montreal Toronto Express, Jewish Culture and Literature North of the Border. Well, depending on what side of the border you are at the moment, I personally am in Canada. And let me tell you that according to the East European calendar, today, on the 1st of March, is the first day of spring. So happy spring, everyone. I don't know what the weather looks like where you are, but here in Ottawa, where I'm talking to you from, it's a wonderful sunny day, very suitable for the first day of spring. Our series of talks is co-organized by Old Dominion University, the very Jewish Canadian Studies program at the University of Ottawa, which I represent, and the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. Our distinguished guest today is author and poet and a very, very interesting person, Chantal Ringuet. I am not going to introduce her right now myself because I will leave this pleasure to our moderator, Dr. Peter Schulman. And instead, I will introduce him. Dr. Peter Schulman is professor of French and International Studies at Old Dominion University. He is the author of a number of impressive books and translations. He's the author of the Sunday of Fiction, The Modern French Eccentric, as well as Le Dernier Livre du Siècle with Misha Zabotin. He has translated Jules Verne's last novel, The Secret of William Storitz. Wow, I didn't know it even existed. I learned something new. I hope you're excited to learn that piece of information as well. Other works by Dr. Schulman include translating Georges Simenon's The 15 Culprits, as well as A Mediation on Waves by Marie Dariussec, on waves, and Suburban Beauty from poet Jacques Reda, Adama from poet Céline Zans. Also Ying Cheng's collection of haiku, Impressions of Summer, and Sylvia Baron Superville's, I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name, Pages of Travel. Dr. Schulman is currently co-editor-in-chief of a journal of eco-criticism, Green Humanities, together with Josh Weinstein. And he has also co-edited the following books: The Marketing of Eros, Performance, Sexuality, and Consumer Culture; Chasing Esther, Jewish Expressions of Cultural Difference; and Rhine Crossings, France and German in Love and War, published in 2004. Dr. Schulman's other translation is that of Marie Nimier's play Another Year, Another Christmas, Noël revient tous les ans, which was performed by the Haberdasher Theatre Company in Columbus, Ohio, and New York City in November 2017. Now, I really want to read all those books and all those texts, and especially to see that play when it is possible again for us to go and see actual plays, actual performances. Now I'm giving floor to Dr. Schulman to introduce Chantal, and I'm looking forward to listening to their conversation. Please.
Good. Thank you so much, Natalia, for that introduction. I'm a bit embarrassed, actually, like the voluminous research into my life. But I too would like to welcome our audience to the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater and the Simon Family JCC's Lee and Bernard Jaffe Family Jewish Book Festival, which has been going on for many years. And we are so happy to be partnering with ODU's Department of World Languages and Cultures, the Canadian Association of Jewish Scholars, and the Vered Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Ottawa, as Natalia just mentioned. And a special shout out to Dr. Hernan Tesler-Mab, who will be participating in the third event in our series, for your generosity and openness. It's really beautiful to create this friendship across borders. Um, and to bring you this, to share this Canadian Jewish experience through culture and literature. But before we begin, a few programming notes. Today's event is brought to you in a webinar format, so you will be muted throughout the program and you will not be able to see the other attendees. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We will try to address as many questions as possible, with time permitting. And so now it's such an honor and a privilege to introduce our first speaker, Chantal Ringuet, who's leading us off in this series. And Chantal Ringuet is an award-winning Canadian author, scholar, and translator. She's written collections of poems and works on Yiddish Montreal. With Gérard Rabinovich, she has published The Révolution de Leonard Cohen, which received a 2017 Canadian Jewish Literary Award. And with Pierre Anctil, she has published a translation of the original biography of Marc Chagall, Egens. She has been a fellow at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York, a scholar in residence at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, a writer in residence and literary translator in residence at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity, among many publications, another book on Leonard Cohen, and lots of exciting things. So it's a great honor to present and to share with you the work of Chantal Ringuet. So the first question I have actually, and I'm not the only one to ask this, but what drew you to Yiddish? I know you grew up in a Francophone city, Quebec City, which is a beautiful city, but we don't always associate it with Yiddish. So how did you come across this?
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Peter, for this beautiful introduction and for this nice invitation. Thanks to your partners involved in organizing this event and for your wonderful questions. It's a real honor to be with you today and to be your guest speaker for this series entitled Toronto Montreal Express. And first of all, I have a lot to share with you today. I want to say that the last 10 years have been, this has been a prolific period on my side, and I was not alone in this. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank a few people who supported my work and encouraged me to pursue in this direction. Pierre Anctil, of course, Sherry Simon, Gérard Rabinovich, Jonathan Sarna, Ira Robinson, Richard Menkes, Catherine Ellerstein, Jean Grondin, Naïm Katan, Francine Kaufmann, Simone Grossman, Laser Letter Handler, Lisa Fishbein-Yoffe, and Vivian Felsen, to name just a few. Now, to answer your question, I will start sharing my screen. Okay, so I grew up, as you mentioned, in Quebec City, which is known as the Bastion de la Langue Française in North America. And it's a privileged environment where I spent many years as a student at l'École des Ursulines de Québec. This is what you can see on the images here. It's a French Catholic school founded in 1639 by Marie de l'Incarnation, who was a French religious coming from Tours in France. And that is the oldest institution of learning for women in North America. As a schoolgirl, there were no Jews around, nor traces of Jewish culture that I was aware of, not around me. And Quebec City, as you probably know, is a city where almost everybody speaks French, including those who are of English or Scottish descent. I received an education where I learned the importance of dialogue between cultures and religions, where community engagement was strong, as well as democratic values pertaining to women's rights, natives' rights, and also more generally to human rights. And besides, in my youth, when I first heard about the Holocaust and how Jews were treated during the Second World War, I felt a strong sense of injustice. I became interested in Jewish culture as an adult. I moved to Montreal in the 1990s to study literature, and later, during my PhD, I was working on migrant writers and exile writers. At some point, I discovered that there had been an important cultural, literary, and artistic movement that I didn't know of. So that was, of course, Yiddish Montreal. So I heard that um, Montreal was the second most important city in North America for Yiddish culture after New York, something that I never knew of, something that I had never heard in my history classes. And I found that fascinating. Um, by the way, what you can see on the screen right now are a few images about Montreal. On the left, a map of Montreal. And in the middle, it's a letter written with the handwriting, beautiful handwriting of Yiddish poet Rachel Cohen, whom I will speak more about in a few minutes. Rachel Cohen arrived in Montreal in 1948, and she spent the last 35 years of her life living near the mountain in the city, de Mont-Royal. On the right, you have a beautiful picture of women working in the garment industry. So that was a very important industry at the time, a place where many Jews, many immigrants were working to earn their lives. Many of them were poets, activists, artists, but to earn a living, you know, they had to work in garment industry. So, and that echoes also my childhood because my grandmother, though she was not an industrial worker, not at all, but she was a seamstress, a professional seamstress. So the more I read about the topic, the more I got fascinated reading David Rome, reading Pierre Anctil, and reading also Naïm Katan, who was writing at the time for the Cercle de la Langue Française. And I got interested by the scope and the realizations of Yiddish immigrants who got involved in the founding of social and democratic institutions who were also, of course, literary people. In the 20th century, there were so many activities that you can do in Yiddish. There was the Yiddish theater. There was a press that became the most important Yiddish press in North America. And, you know, when you do some studies in literature for a long time, and then you realize that you didn't know anything about it, it's very surprising. So I guess that as an outsider, I saw things differently. And also, I was now living in a metropolis divided in two languages, French and English. And there you could feel that Francophone culture was a minority culture in North America. I don't really like to speak about minority, but from an historical standpoint, this was the case, obviously. And this is something that you really can feel in Quebec City when you grow up there. And so maybe that fragility brought me to develop a high sensitivity to an endangered language as Yiddish. Now, ever since my childhood, no, ever since I was a high school student, mostly, I've been fascinated by languages. I was also a PhD student in philosophy for a while. I learned ancient Greek and German before finding my intellectual path. I couldn't find it in Plato's work nor in the Greeks' rational thought. And it's really through Jewish culture that I found what was at the very core of philosophy: astonishment. So, this is how philosophy emerged. One day, an individual got astonished to discover the being surrounding him, and then developing a critical thought, critical thinking about it. So, l'étonnement face à tout ce qui est, as we say in French. In the same manner, it's my astonishment for Jewish culture surrounding us, surrounding me at the time in Montreal, that brought me to delve into this topic, to learn Yiddish, and later on to act as, I would say, as a cultural translator. A literary translator, of course, because I did some translations and I'm still translating from Yiddish to French, but also cultural translator, which means for me to translate one culture to another. And I guess the déclic, or the pivotal moment, was when I discovered, I mentioned that, the golden age of Yiddish Montreal in the interwar period. And that happened, as I mentioned, because I was an outsider, probably. And there's also another reason. At the time, I was very involved in psychoanalysis. I was once training to become a psychoanalyst myself, and I think the Freudian experience opened a new path through Jewish culture.
Wow, that was enthralling trajectory. Really, I could listen to more for hours. But I'm also curious. You mentioned the cultural translation, which I find fascinating, and actual physical translations of Yiddish authors. What drew you to those authors in particular, and especially like Rachel Korn? And what was that process like? Translating Yiddish is a very difficult language.
Yes, yes. Rachel Cohen, to me, was a very important woman on the Yiddish literary scene. I will show you a photo. I'll get back to I'll start sharing my screen again. You can see her. Yeah, there you go. Always takes a few seconds. So here she is when she was very young. This is a photo courtesy from the YIVO archives. Rachel Cohen was already a published and an acclaimed Yiddish woman poet in the interwar period in Poland. She started writing in Polish and then continued her literary career in Yiddish. This is very, very interesting. And when the war broke out, she had time to go to Moscow to meet with Sutzkever. Prior to that, she was very involved in journalism, in the literary milieu. She had a famous love story with Melech Chavich, who was a cosmopolitan Yiddish writer who also emigrated later on to Montreal. And so Rachel Cohen was a very important figure at that time, and she was a very important figure for feminism as well, for putting forward women's rights, women's justice, as well as her friend Katya Molodovsky. This brings me to say that historians and scholars who read only archival documents about New France and the conflictual relationship between the French and the British in the 18th and the 19th century miss something important. It's those voices, so voices of the immigrants. And then you have to do some research in the archives. There's so many treasuries to discover. It happened, so historians and scholars missing something important. It happened with the natives, as we know, but it also happened with the Jewish community and culture. To me, poetry and music reflect the very spirit of this culture. So I work more on poetry and translations since the last years, and I find a particular connection with Rachel Cohen, with her poetry and Also, she's always been writing about trees from the interwar period until later on in her life, the trees on the Mont Royal with the Galician orchards in Galicia. And the trees is a metaphor of life, of course, of continuation um, of the diaspora as well, because it's the opposite, you know. It's about being uprooted or rooted somewhere. And I recently wrote an article in the literary journal Germanica about her in a great issue that just came out on Yiddish literature, co-edited by Michel Taubert and Marie Brune. And furthermore, what I did not expect, Rachel Cohen made her way into my poems. And I actually finished a new manuscript of poetry, which starts with Rachel Cohen. So the first chapter is 40 pages. It's all about Rachel Cohen's journey from Poland to Tashkent in Uzbekistan, to Stockholm where she was a refugee at some point just after the Second World War, and then to Montreal. To better answer your question, maybe, I think we need rigorous work on these authors and what they bring us. We've heard a lot about Anglo-Jewish writers in Montreal who wrote about the mountain in the city, the Mont Royal, with A.M. Klein and others. Also from young Yiddish male poets, Yud Siegel, Noah Isaac Gottlieb. But Rachel Cohen was, you know, she was living on Maplewood Street, 2 streets away from the mountain. And during all her life, you know, she wrote a lot about her different experiences. So it's about the diaspora, and it's also a woman who was an international poet, but who wrote in Yiddish and whose writings are little known nowadays, outside from the Yiddishist world, I'm sorry, because she is not translated much. She hasn't been much translated. So I think her work deserves to be known in other languages, including French. And this is what I call being a cultural translator. It's not only about translating a text, it's also translating a voice, of course, but one culture into another, which is not, there is another layer of significance added to that work.
Wow, that was really a beautiful tale of translation work, which I know is really hard. And I got to see some of your translation there. It was the beautiful language. The French really marries well with the Yiddish, it looks like. But you yourself are also a poet and an author, and you hinted a little bit about that in sort of the symbiosis between your translation sort of spilling out into your own work. And I was wondering if you could talk a little about your own poetry or reflections, such as your notebooks on Jerusalem, or Le Sang des Ruines, which is the Blood of Ruins, great title, or the other evocative Under the Skin of War. These are all very compelling texts. And maybe you can talk about them a little bit.
Yes, thank you for your comment. I started writing poetry while I was doing my postdoc research on Yiddish writers and literature. And this is also when I started translating, because I needed to translate text from Yiddish to French for my academic essays. And later on, I translated more. So I started writing poetry, and the Sang des Ruines, so it was my debut collection, as we can say. It's about the voices, it focuses on the voice of 2 Holocaust survivors, 1 man and 1 woman. I can show you an image while sharing my screen again. Yes, so that's the book. There weren't that many people writing about the Holocaust at the time in French in Quebec. Since then, Louise Dupré has written Plus haut que les flammes, for example, which is a very beautiful book. There had been a few, but not that many, apart from Régine Robin, of course. So in English, the title would be The Blood of the Ruins. Later on, in a different perspective, I have been working at the National Gallery of Canada in the publications department. And I was working at the time as an editor, French editor and translator. They were organizing a big show on British photojournalist Don McCollin. And, you know, working day after day on Don McCollin's photographs is something very interesting because for those of you who know McCollin, he's well known throughout the world, but not that much in Quebec though. McCollin's photos are all black and it's about war. It's about the Vietnam War, the Lebanese wars, and all his photos are very black, not only somber, but he used a technical process in order to avoir les tirages encore plus noirs, as we say in French. So McCollin came to visit the museum. He gave a guided tour of the exhibition, and then I could hear speak about his own journey through his artwork, although he wouldn't consider himself as an artist. So he was talking about his practice, and what I found very striking was when he said that he did all those photographs to give voice to those who would remain unheard because they were civilians, you know, victims of wars. And I thought that was very compelling. 2 days later, it was a Sunday winter morning, I started writing some prose in English and about his experience, about his photos. And then I sent it to him, wondering if it was of interest or not. And his answer was so positive that he encouraged me to continue, which I did. I continued writing about his photographs in French. And then the book came out. So it's a particular book because it's both prose and poetry, French and English, inspired by the photographs, but there's no photos in that book, which is you know, we all know Don McCollin's photographs. You can find them everywhere on the web, so that's not a problem. But I also like the fact that it's not translations. It's every text works there on its own, and there's a special connection between text and images, something that has always been very important to me since the beginning of my work. Now, to answer your question about the third book, that's the one, Un pays où la terre se fragmente, carnet de Jérusalem. In English, we would say, in a country where land fragments, Jerusalem notebooks. When you work on Yiddish and Jewish culture, you need to travel. You need to travel in order to learn the language, but also to visit old Jewish places in Europe, as well as memorials and commemoration sites. The old neighborhoods, well, where there used to be a vibrant cultural, literary, and artistic life until World War II. This brought me to go to Jerusalem and the Middle East many times, and the book is the result of 6 trips that I did there between 2006 and 2016. I was once living in Jerusalem for a few months, and I had the privilege to encounter many writers and artists and to interview them during the Jerusalem International Festival, which takes place in the beautiful environment of Mishkanot Sha'ananim, for those of you who know the place. So people like David Grossman, Rouya Shalev, Aaron Appelfeld, Edgar Keret, and many others. So that was so interesting that I thought, perhaps I should do something about it. Then Linda Leach, who was the founder of Blue Metropolis Festival, became a publisher, and she asked me, why don't you write a blog about your travel and your meetings with writers? And this is how it all started. And finally, the book came out in 2017. I would say that maybe there's a link with poetry in the structure of the text, because I wanted to organize it in 26 chapters so that it corresponds to the number of letters that you have in the Hebrew alphabet.
Mm.
And in French, I call those chapters contre-champ. In English, it corresponds to reverse angles, like in music. And so that it presents different perspectives on the Middle East through my own gaze and also through uh, women's voices.
Wow. That looks like obviously like compelling reading. We have to read that. And but also those beautiful books. I mean, we hinted at these pictures of Jewish life in Montreal, discovering Yiddish Montreal, Yiddish voices of Montreal. Perhaps you could share some special aspects of Jewish Montreal that are highlighted in those books, and do they contribute to preservation of memory or collective memory in such a changing city?
Thank you for this question. I think it's a very important question. Perhaps I can show you. I can start by sharing my screen again in order to show you the book cover of the first book that I published on Yiddish Montreal. So that's the one, à la découverte du Montréal Yiddish in French. So in English, it would be Discovering Yiddish Montreal. This was actually the result of my postdoctoral research. And at the time, you know, in an academic's journey, usually you must publish a book from your research. And I thought if I write an academic book, I won't reach a wide audience. And what I wanted to do at the time was to give something that I had received from that culture, like astonishment, like, you know, this particular feeling of wow, a kind of illumination that I felt when I discovered that culture. And so I decided instead to write a cultural and historical synthesis of Jewish Montreal. And I worked with the archivists. I really want to thank the archivists, all the archivists with whom I've been working during the last years. Their work is so important in helping scholars and writers to achieve their work. So in this book, you can find a general introduction to Jewish Montreal. There are 150 archival documents. And so it's for a wide audience as well as for scholars. You have a lot about music. So you can have it depicts a portrait of that community from its early beginning to the end. And at the end, there were also a few paths. It was also like a guide that the last chapter invites you to discover the traces of Yiddish Montreal at the time. Now, I must say that the book was published in 2011, and some of the places that still existed at the time don't exist anymore. For example, Beauties, the restaurant, the diner at the corner of Saint-Urbain and Montreal doesn't exist anymore. It was destroyed a year ago, I think. And also the Burson monuments. It was the last place on Saint Laurent Boulevard on the Main, the corridor of immigration, of Jewish immigration. It was the last place where you could see some Hebrew letters, Mitzavis, and it closed not so long ago. And we know that in the 1930s, Yiddish was, you could see and hear Yiddish everywhere on that street, on that boulevard. So it's very important, I think, to share what we know about this culture. For me, as an outsider, as I mentioned before, because I think it's part of a collective memory and history, if not memory, history. Many people have different opinions on the topic. Some people think that history is first, national, something that deals more with nationalism. I think that I have a more inclusive perspective, and I think that it's a real patrimony. It has shaped Montreal and Montreal's history at the beginning of the 20th century, and so it's a universal patrimony as well.
Well, I can't wait to buy the book so that I can go on a guided visit of these traces of memory. It's something that's very beautiful. I do that in New York a lot, and so I'd like to do that in Montreal. And you've also written a book on Marc Chagall, the painter, which contributed to an exhibit of which I saw actually in Montreal at the Musée des Beaux-Arts. Tell us what brought you to him. And there's also like an exciting story about how you discovered a Yiddish manuscript that he had written. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. That's very exciting.
Yes, certainly. Um, I was I had the privilege to be fellow at YIVO, so the Institute for Jewish Research in New York in 2015, and then scholar in residence at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, which brought me to work on Cohen and Katia Molodowski, two Yiddish women poets. Now, so 3 days, so there's a big story about Chagall because I was not planning to work on Chagall. It just happened, and that's the beauty of this story. 3 days before leaving New York, there was an event at YIVO entitled Highlights and Treasures from the YIVO Archives, where you could see original manuscripts from Shalom Aleichem, other important Yiddish writers. There were also musical sound archives. And I remember seeing that letter that was signed Marc Chagall. Actually, it was not a letter, it was a tapuscrit, so a manuscript, typed manuscript. And then I was I was amazed again. I was surprised to associate Marc Chagall and Yiddish. To me, it was not clear that Yiddish was Chagall's Mameloshen. And I started working with the archivist Leo Greenbaum at YIVO for the last 2 days that I spent in New York instead of going to museums and cafes to do some research, because I thought, wow, that's so amazing. What we knew in French, and I do have this very famous book about Marc Chagall, Ma vie de Marc Chagall. I'm trying to be to wrap up. Marc Chagall, Ma vie, translated from Russian by Bella Chagall. This is what was written in the book published by Stock Editions in Paris in 1931, and all the further editions would mention that. So I thought that his maternal language was Russian. Now, when you know more about Jewish culture and East European Jewish culture, of course Yiddish. Of course Chagall knew Yiddish when you know that he came from Vitebsk and, all his background. So I'm also very interested in Andrei Markovich's French translation of the Stoyafsky. So Markovich tried to render the voice, the authenticity of the voice and the characters in Dostoevsky's text, instead of transforming Dostoevsky's into a French writer through translations. And that's very important, and that guided my work at the time. So I asked a friend, can you show me, can you scan me the first and the last pages of that book so that I could compare what I have here in Yiddish at YIVO? It turned out that there were many differences between the two manuscripts. And so I said, we have to do this translation, to have a new translation from Yiddish to French. It turned out that Chagall's original autobiography entitled Agents had been published in a literary journal in New York entitled Die Zukunft. I will show you an image in a second. So there we are. On the left, you can see the cover image of Die Zukunft. It's very beautiful design. And on the right, so we translated the book, and finally, I didn't know that there was a Chagall exhibition coming up at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts at the time. I was just trying to have the rights cleared with the Chagall's granddaughter in Paris. And when I've heard that they were organizing a big show on Chagall. So I thought, wow, we have to do this translation right on time so that it should appear for the exhibition. And what I had to do with the museum at the time was to give a lecture, of course, about Chagall's life, his background, and his journey from Eastern Europe to Paris, to North America, and so on. And to give some training to the docent at the museum. Now I'm going to stop here. I could speak a lot more about Chagall, but I think we won't have time. We won't have more time.
Indeed, we could speak for hours and hours about these enthralling topics. So I didn't realize time was going by so fast either, which is a good thing. But so I want to slip in a question about Leonard Cohen before we hear you read maybe one of your translations of Rahel Cohen. Just out of curiosity, so if this weren't enough, like Dayenu, like how did you get involved in Leonard Cohen too and become one of the experts on his work?
Yes. Well, it happened by chance, I would say, because in 2014, I published this anthology entitled Voix Yiddish de Montréal, that you can see on the left, Yiddish Voices of Montreal, in French translations. And the publisher asked me to write a preface for a book on Leonard Cohen. It started with that preface. And then 2014, I realized that Leonard Cohen was going to turn 80. It's in September. So I thought, wow, we have to do something about it. We have to organize an event celebrating his work. And Leonard Cohen loved Paris and French culture. So I thought perhaps it would be a good idea to do something in Paris. So I contacted Gérard Rabinovich, who was the director of l'Institut Européen Emmanuel Lévinas, which is part of l'Alliance Israélite Universelle, a very important organization in France. And he welcomed my idea. So that fall, 2014, we organized a one-day conference on Leonard Cohen. And then I thought, but now we have to make a book because otherwise we won't have any traces. Well, there was a recording, a video recording of that event, but I thought we needed a book. And especially about Leonard Cohen, I thought that it would be interesting to include contributions from both scholars and also people who were artists or writers who had been personally influenced by Leonard Cohen in their own practice. So the book came out as it was a partnership between that institution and Concordia University, the Institute for Canadian Jewish Studies there. And the year later, the book received an award. And in the meantime, Leonard Cohen passed away in November 2014, on November 7. It was a Monday. And I remember that because I had a lot of magical moments with Leonard Cohen. And one of those was the second launch of that book. The first launch was in April in a bookstore. And the second was organized by the Institute at Concordia on November 7, 2014. And there were a few people, students, and Naim Katan was there. We had a nice event. But later on, to hear that he passed away the same night, it's quite something, you know. And it's also like, wow, there were many people that night thinking about him in his beloved hometown, Montreal. And very quickly, then I was asked by Dominique Guillou in Paris to write a duetto on Leonard Cohen. Duetto is a collection of very short books from a writer who tells his love story, or a story about a writer that has been very important to him. This was in 2019, and this is the exhibition catalog of that famous and beautiful exhibition on Leonard Cohen that was organized in 2017-18, and to which I participated as a senior consultant, working with John Zepitelli, the director, and Victor Schiffman, and so on. So I think I'm going to stop here.
Wow, that's an incredible story too. You have so many incredible, voluminous stories.
That's why I wanted to thank all the people that who encouraged me in all these publications and realization achievements.
It's lovely. Before I hand it off to Natalia, I just want to know if you can just read one of the poems of Rachel Cohen, just so we can hear.
Yes, I have two poems of Rachel Cohen here in my English translations. One of them is a famous poem. Well, I mean, one of her most well-known poems that has been translated already in English. But here's my translation. In Yiddish, it's von jener Zeitlied, on the other side of the poem. On the other side of the poem, an orchard. In the orchard, a house with a thatched roof, three pine trees towering, speechless, three watchmen standing at attention. On the other side of the poem, a fledgling, a golden brown fledgling with a reddish breast. Every winter it returns here and hangs like a bud in the naked bush. On the other side of the poem, a path as thin and sharp as a hairline fissure, and someone wandering, lost in time, treads on the path barefoot in silence. On the other side of the poem, miracles happen even now, on this day, gloomy and gray, when on the window pane blows still the feverish longing of a painful hour. On the other side of the poem, my mama appears, standing in the doorway, lost in thought, calling me home as long ago, long ago. You've played enough, Rachel. You've played enough. Don't you see? It's nighttime.
Amazing. That was really beautiful. I can't wait to read all of Rachel Cohen too now. And so I'll pass it on to Natalia, and we'll field some questions too. And I remind you tonight too, Lisa Richter will be reading her own poetry, but also talking about Anna Margolin, the Yiddish poet, and that's also going to be very enthralling. So Natalia, I'm going to look at our questions too, by the way. So
yeah, thank you, Chantal. Thank you, Peter, for this most stimulating conversation. I'm sure our audience enjoyed it very much. And especially thank you, Chantal, for your reading of Rachel Cohen's poem. It was a real treat. It is very appropriate that we mentioned, that you mentioned your work on Leonard Cohen, because this year we are celebrating the 65th anniversary since the publication of Leonard Cohen's first book of poetry, Let Us Compare Mythologies. So maybe we could talk about your work on Leonard Cohen a little further. I have your book, one of your books here, the book La Révolution de Leonard Cohen, and also I have your catalog, which I'm especially interested in. Incidentally, this morning I opened my morning newspaper, which is the Globe and Mail, and there was an article about a virtual version of the exhibition. Which is unfortunately only accessible to Canadians now. Sorry, American friends, because of I guess copyright issues. Did you participate in that project and the virtual exhibit project? And if yes, can you tell us something about it and how is it different from the real offline thing, except for being online?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Natanya. I did not participate in this virtual exhibition in the sense that it's one person who has put the exhibition online, who organized the whole thing. I'm not that much into digital work, but as I said, I was a consultant for the narratives in the exhibition. I wrote the wall text, and we had a couple of meetings discussing many issues, including the fact that at the time when Leonard Cohen died, many of the artists, I mean, all of the artists who were creating their artworks that was going to be part of the exhibition, they were kind of troubled. Many of them could not work anymore because, he just died, it disappeared. And that was a very fragile, difficult moment for many of them. And so, there were some issues, and it all resolved very well, I think. And in this process, the what I was involved when the exhibition was presented at the Jewish Museum of New York. We had a wonderful round table there with Sylvie Simmons, with two other persons as well. And so we were able to share on Leonard Cohen, his connection to Judaism, to New York as well, because he studied, as you know, at Columbia as a young man. And I thought that the exhibition presented in New York was very elegant. It was not all the artworks that you could find at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Montreal, because they don't have enough rooms, simply for that reason. It was two-thirds of the whole exhibition. But it was like a different side of Leonard Cohen, although those were the same artworks.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I was one of the first visitors of that original exhibition at Le Musée d'Art Contemporain in Montreal. I was very privileged to have a special invitation and see all those installations when there were almost no people, no crowd. And it was a very special, a very personal experience. Uh, I especially enjoyed, if it's the right word, his self-portraits, the 220 rotating images rotating in a quick succession, and the poetry machine.
Yeah.
What are your favorite pieces of the exhibit? Do you have any?
Yes, of course. My two favorites, as I love archives and black and white images, were the two artworks. The first by George Folk, where you could see throughout the time Leonard Cohen in concert. So I think it was the main artwork that you could see entering in the exhibition. There were many others that I did like, though, but that one I really liked it.
There's actually a question from the audience that relates to this. Um, what most moved you about Leonard Cohen's work? Um,
I could say many things, but there is one thing that I think he teaches that through his own poetry, his music, and his personal journey. It's that in order to create art, you have to experience failure. This is something that happened to him many times, and it kind of structured his life at different periods. There are I could tell about maybe more about a few moments, but just one. 1966, when he published Beautiful Losers, his second novel, he really wanted to be a Canadian writer. He was already an acclaimed poet, Canadian acclaimed poet, and he was living in Hydra at the time. And this was a commercial failure. Uh, the critics didn't like his work in Canada. I know that some critics liked his work in London, in Britain, but not in Canada. We have to remind that it's an Anglo-Protestant culture, and all that you find, all the excesses that you find in that book were not well perceived. And for him, it led him to one of his very important depressing phases. But this failure at the same time brought him to stop writing novels and then to move to New York, to go to the Chelsea Hotel. And it, in a certain way, it launched his musical career with the time, it was not known. He didn't know many people of the folk scene in New York when he arrived at Chelsea Hotel. But this is really where he first met the important people. Columbia Record gave him his first contract. And then he launched Songs of Leonard Cohen at the end of the 1960s. So this particular dynamic between failure and success, there's a kind of gravity and lightness, two very important themes in Cohen's work that we find through this example, for example. And also his spiritual journey, the hybridity that you find in it. These are some aspects that are important to me.
You're right to say that there's a pattern in Leonard Cohen's life and work when a failure leads to further success and to a glorious change of path. It's exactly what happened when he was robbed of his life savings by his manager. It all led to his super successful world tours of his final years and to this huge revival of Leonard Cohen as a singer-songwriter and as a phenomenon. Well, thank you so much. I wish this conversation lasted for hours and hours, but I'm sure we have some questions from the audience. Do we have questions from the audience?
We did. We answered one of them actually, and we are actually out of time though. So
Not surprised.
there's a very long, complicated French question about whether you feel like you're part of the Jewish culture or if you're a Quebecoise. That I don't know if you want to address that, and then we should close our program.
If I understand well, if I'm part of Jewish culture, and can you rephrase it?
Yeah, no, it's a long French question. I'm trying to paraphrase it. Something about
how I perceive myself.
Yeah, that's it.
Now I'm very familiar to this culture. I'm also very sensitive to this culture, and I'm still what I am. I mean, I'm from Quebec. I'm a Quebecer. I was born and raised Catholic. I didn't convert to Judaism, and I don't plan to, because then you lose the distance to the work that you can do as a cultural translator, maybe. So everybody has his own position or her own position about that, but this is mine. And I guess my conversion was more linguistic, intellectual. It's through the language. And this is something that I really appreciate in Leonard Cohen's work. I wrote an article published in our book, Les Révolutions de Leonard Cohen, entitled Habiter le langage, poétiser l'exil. So the way you inhabit the language.
Yeah.
And language is not only Yiddish or French. It's not only une langue, as we say in French. It's much more. It can be music. It can be poetry.
Wow, that was beautiful. I can't thank you enough for this outstanding conversation, and thank you, Natalia, for joining in too for this friendship we have now with the Verde Institute. And it's been such a pleasure for joining us, joining our community. For those who want to buy your books, you can find them on your website, maybe, or uh,
Yes.
so chantalranguet.com, or
Yes.
okay. So I encourage you to read these wonderful books. It will definitely enrich your lives. Yes, this is the great first part of our three-part Montreal Toronto Express series. And join us tonight at 7:30 for part two as we host um, the award-winning poet and author Lisa Richter, who will be talking about her book Nautilus and Bone that just won a Jewish Literary Prize, and her enthralling work about Anna Margolin. I guarantee you shouldn't miss it. It's going to be lovely, and you can register at jewishva.org/bookfest for all our book festival events as well, and to register. So I hope to see you later tonight. And thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Chantal and Natalia. That was great.